going to share sort of my own journey and just sort of some of the things that I've learned within that and my journey of sort of discovering my leadership style and what it means to lead out of that. And I think one of the things that has meant for me in this journey is realizing that my leadership style is not distinctive from who I am, and that discovering my leadership style and the way that I lead is really intimately tied into understanding who I am and being able to fully embrace that. And so I've been leading at Parkcrest in some capacity for 17 years. I came there in 2000 as a high school pastor, changed roles along the way, and eventually, almost 10 years ago now, I became the lead pastor. When I became the lead pastor, it was stupid in a lot of ways because I was 29 years old when I took over the church. We had like 50-something staff members, including our school. We had like a $2.9 million budget. Like I did not know what I was doing. That's a true story? Yes. Yeah, and so some of the stories that I'll share too, I appreciate. I know a handful of you in here than staying in this room. So I became lead pastor at 29, and I began a transition to become lead pastor at 27. Our lead pastor, he had been on staff for 38 years. He had been our pastor for 30 of those years. He went through a 2-year retirement where I was moving into it. So at 27, I was asked by the elders to move into the lead role at our church. At 29, was fully commissioned as the lead pastor at our church, and was just like young and dumb and insecure, but did not think that I was young and dumb and insecure. Like I thought like I am this bitchin' leader because like they would ask me to lead the church, of course, like look at how good I am. And one of the things that I did during the transition into becoming lead pastor was they gave me some time and some money to be able to go around and meet with a bunch of different pastors and just learn from whoever I could. And so I had some great people who opened themselves up to me, who I was able to go around the country and spend time with, and got to learn from some incredible pastors, some pastors who were leading huge churches, some pastors who were leading small churches and doing really interesting things. There was the pastor who like always wanted to take the next film. Wherever he was never good enough, and he's never content. And you're just like energized by this like leader who's always pushing forward. And then there was the pastor of the 20,000 person church who every Monday would call every single first-time visitor in his church, would give them a phone call. And then told me, and he said, and I performed every single funeral that people ask me to do. So sometimes I'm doing 15 or 20 funerals a week. There was the pastor who locked himself in a room for probably about 30 hours a week and did nothing but work on his sermon, and then would like see his staff before he preached and let them know what he was doing. And then there's a pastor who did the exact opposite of that, who like played basketball all week and hung out with people and like would think about what he's going to speak on, and then like shows up on Sunday and gives a brilliant message. There's a pastor who told me that the most effective thing that you can do is pour all of your energy, money, and time into your weekend services and spend like your energy in that direction. And then there is the one who told me the most effective thing that you can do is to downplay the weekend and pour all of your energy and effort into community groups during the week that are invested in people's lives and in the homes. There's the pastor who was really much more like a CEO than he was a pastor and ran an incredibly effective business. And to the point where every person who worked for him, every one of the pastors who worked for him, and he had a fairly large church, they had to turn into him a weekly progress report of who they met with that week, of who they talked, every phone call. They had to record the phone call, what they talked about with that person. They had to write, like, here are my 5 goals for this week, and here's the accomplishments that I made towards those goals this week. Here's what the attendance was in my ministry this week. This is what I expected it to be. This is why it was down 7 people from what I thought it would be, who did all of that. There was the one who spent most of his week in solitude and in prayer rhythms and in like spiritual formation practices like that. There was the one who told me that his role was he would show up and they would gather their staff together and he would give an inspirational talk once a week. And then he would kind of go off and he was doing other things, and that gave them sort of like the direction, and that's the way that he led. And then there was the one who had meetings every week, several meetings where he wanted to know what was going on with everything. And so he would delegate out, here's these things that you do. And then what he would do is throughout the week, he would meet with every team that was doing stuff to see where they were at, to push them forward, to challenge what they were doing. And so he would spend, instead of the 30 hours a week on the sermon, he was spending 30 hours a week in meetings. And then there was the one, which was one of my favorite meetings. I was in Houston meeting with this pastor, and he said the way that he led was he just took people with him everywhere. And he was the kind of leader where it's taught, and you just kind of need to be around him a lot. So he's like, why don't I take you to the Houston Astros baseball game? And so we hung out at the Astros game, where he had also brought like 8 people from his church with him as well. And I was like, that's the way that I could lead. And then I was following this pastor who had been pastor for 30 years. He had been at our church 38 years. He'd been the pastor 30 years. And I was 29 stepping into his role. So I was young. He was leading longer than I had been alive. And we were opposites, and are opposites in so many ways. He loved being a pastor. I avoid telling people that I'm a pastor. He was empathetic. I'm whatever is the opposite of empathetic, a jerk. He's kind of like the steady, slow prodding, like keep moving forward kind of person. Like I'm just gonna keep going in that same direction. If I keep going in that same direction long enough, eventually we're gonna get traction. And I'm like sporadic, and I have ADD, and I'm like all over the place. He would adopt and contextualize ideas. He never wanted to be the first. He never wanted to be at the forefront of something. He wanted to take something slow. He wanted to see other people do it. He wanted to see how it worked. And then he would take it and he'd adopt it and adapt it. And I'm the exact opposite of that. That I'm like, well, let's be the ones who are like the first ones trying to figure this out, and let's like screw it up a whole bunch. He would be slow and deliberative in decision making. I'm intuitive. I need to fully throw myself into something in order to figure it out. I need to not sit around and have 8 million discussions about it. I just kind of need to step into it and try it. And so I had all these pictures in my mind of what I was supposed to be like as a leader. And I would try incredibly hard to be a whole lot of them. Because at 29, didn't really fully know who I was. I thought I knew who I was, but I only somewhat knew who I was. And so all of these different leaders who I had a lot of respect for and learned a ton from were like ghosts over my shoulder. And every time something was going on in the church and I had to engage in something, somebody was upset about something or a crisis happened, there were these ghosts over my shoulder. And I was like, well, how would this guy do it? How would this person do it? How would this woman do it? And there were all these ghosts constantly over me. I remember the first crisis I had in our church was a month into being lead pastor. A month into it, I got a phone call from one of our missionaries that one of our elders had embezzled $50,000 from him, which is a fun phone call to get. And what happens in crisis is you end up acting out of all of your insecurities if you're not settled in who you are. And so it starts being like, okay, how would this person do this and this person do this? And I have this weight on me. I went through periods of time where I was not sleeping at night. I went through incredibly anxious periods of time. I had this moment, and this is like one of my crux moments where I realized this is not working. The ghosts haunting me aren't working. I was going to visit one of the churches that we were helping to start. It was actually Jack's church, who's hanging out here. And I had a Sunday morning off of preaching, and I was going to go visit his church. And I pull into the parking lot to just go inside and to just be in the service and encourage them and just be there and, root on what they were doing. And I show up there and I park the car, and this had never happened to me before in my life. I parked the car and I'm holding onto the steering wheel, and I can't let go of it. And I couldn't figure out why I couldn't let go of it. I tried, but my body wouldn't do it. And I just began sweating profusely. My heart begins like palpitating, and I just can't move. And people are walking by my car and they're seeing me parked there, and they're like waving at me, and I can like see them out of my peripheral vision, but it's fuzzy. And for 10, 15 minutes, like I sit there, and my hands the entire time are just gripped on the steering wheel. And finally, after 10 or 15 minutes, I was able to like let go of it, and I didn't know what had happened. And so I just start the car. I was like, I can't go inside. I start the car and I go home. And after talking with people, I realized that what had happened was I had my first anxiety attack. There are all these things that had led to that anxiety attack. But one of the things that had led to it was I was trying to be all these things that I wasn't. What we do a lot of times is we develop a typology of a kind of leader that we think that we're supposed to be, and we project ourselves into that. And we try to live into that. And sometimes what we even do, actually, I think more than sometimes, a lot of times what we even do is we convince ourselves that's what we're actually like. And so you take like a leadership assessment, or you take like Strength Finders, or you take Myers-Briggs or something, and you answer it in a way that you believe is truthful. But what it actually is it's you projecting out what you think you're supposed to be, and you've convinced yourself that's who you are, because there are all these pictures, right? And so what we often lead out of is the insecurity of who we are, trying to be somebody else. I think we have to understand who we are. It is a journey of understanding who we are in order to be able to lead and understand our leadership style really well. I did my master's degree in transformational leadership, and a lot of it was wrapped around Strength Finders. Have you guys done Strength Finders? Is that a part? So I think Strength Finders is phenomenal. I understand my strengths, I understand how they operate together, and I would sit in classes like this where the professor was a trained Strength Finder coach and would just integrate Strength Finders into everything we're doing. So it's phenomenal. A part of my master's program was I had to do all this individualized coaching on Strength Finders, where people would like walk me through my strengths and like what that meant for me and what that meant for my leadership and all of that. And so we could sit around, and I would sit around with groups who I was going to school with, and we would talk about our strengths and what that meant and all that. And I understood those things. I read all kinds of books about those things. I could talk about my top 5 strengths. I got my Myers-Briggs type, like I got those things. But what I discovered was that there's something different about owning it than there is about just understanding it, right? I think of a friend of mine, Doug, when we were in high school, he used to watch every kind of like home improvement show. In the days before HGTV and YouTube, it was like This Old House and This Old House knockoffs. And so he would watch that all the time. And people would have this like home improvement idea. We went to college or to church together, and people would have like some home improvement thing they'd be talking about, and he would like butt into the conversation. He's like, I can do that. And they'd say to him like, really, you know how to do that? And he said, well, I've never done it, but I've seen it done a million times. And he convinced himself like he knew how to do it because he'd seen it done, but he'd never actually done it. What would often happen is Doug would eventually get the projects done. Like people in our church would hire him to do it, but it would take twice as long as it would have taken somebody else and cost him twice as much because he was figuring it out on the job. And that's what I realized for me, it happened to me with understanding my strengths and my leadership style. Like I understood those things, but I didn't live those things. I didn't own them. I was too often caught up in the people whose conferences I was going to, the other pastors I was meeting with, the other people, the books I was reading, and then here's these pictures of this is what's successful. And those for me became a barrier to like actually lead out of my own strengths, my own giftedness, my own uniqueness. And so what I had to do, and a part of this was the journey of having that anxiety attack, was I had to go on a journey of trying to understand myself so that I could lead out of those things really well. So I just kind of want to walk you through a handful of the things that have been really helpful for me that I've discovered. And on this sheet, it's kind of on the front side, I'll walk you through kind of what has been helpful for me in this journey. First, I put on there, pay attention to the breadcrumbs. Pay attention to the breadcrumbs. This is how I've started to see like personality assessments and leadership style assessments and those sorts of things. Things like Myers-Briggs, Strength Finders, the Enneagram, DISC, APEST, any of those things. Like I think that they're so good and helpful in a lot of different ways, but what they are is they're breadcrumbs. They are little things that help you move towards a destination, but they're not the destination in and of themselves. They are not the point in and of themselves. And so I've discovered I have two different reactions to like leadership assessments or personality assessments and stuff. One is I will have relief at times because I finally have language. I can finally like, oh yes, that is who I am. That makes sense of it, and I can like put words to it. I remember we would do performance reviews every year before I was senior pastor, and we would do these performance reviews because we got rid of them. And this will give you a little bit of insight into why we did, and we've reinstituted them in a healthier way. But when I would go through the performance review, we would have like a 1 to 5 scale and all these different things. And I would be told a couple of things. I would be told, well, I'm not going to give you a 5 because like we always want you to have room for improvement. So I was like, so a 4 is essentially a 5 is what you're saying. Like that's essentially what this means. But the second thing was every single time I would do my performance review, what would be written on like room for improvement was always, you need to work on your pride. And I'd be like, what? Like, I'm the most humble guy I know. What are you talking about? I'm awesome. And every time it'd be, you need to work on your pride. And so I'd be like, okay, what do I need to do to work on my pride? Which, by the way, could you imagine like Starbucks, like doing a performance review with their employees and being like, you need to work on your pride. But that's a part of the nature of ministry. So some of you maybe aren't in that different kind of organization, but in ministry, like your character matters. And like that, like I should be growing in character. And so, so he told me, and I'd say like, what do I need to do? And like, help me figure this out. Like, how do you grow in this? And so he'd give me some things to do, and I would do those over the year. And then the next year, what do you need to grow in? You need to grow in, like, you need to deal with your pride. And like, it got like very, very, not only frustrating, but it was very defeating. So I started feeling like, gosh, this is just this thing that I'm never going to get better at. This is this thing that's always going to haunt me, that I'm jacked up in, and I'm not making any progress in. Then when I walked through the strength finders, my number 2 strength finder is self-assurance. And what I learned was that my supervisor is like number 34 is self-assurance. So what was happening, as I unpack this, like years later with a counselor paying hundreds of dollars, what was happening was he was projecting out his lack of security onto my natural security. And so if somebody is naturally self-assured and somebody else is not naturally self-assured, that feels like, gosh, they're just boastful and prideful. And yeah, like I am, like I got to deal with that. But it was not showing up to the extent that he was seeing it, because he was seeing it through his lens. So for me, like there's relief in that, right? But at the other end of the spectrum, there's also this sense of like, I'm like, don't box me in. That I'll read these things on, yeah, that's me-ish. That's not totally who I am. On Instagram a week or two ago, I posted something about how I'm learning to crochet. And why are you going to make fun of me, Bill?
I think I saw that.
So I'm learning to crochet, and I have this like actual real deep sense of conviction and that there's a theology of working with your hands, a spirituality of working with your hands that we've got to reclaim and we need to live into. And so I was learning woodworking, and I'm still woodworking, but I thought like I want to learn something else that's working with my hands. And so learning crocheting. So I posted something about it and about the redemptive nature of working with our hands and reclaiming that in a culture and society that's so digitally oriented and is so moving more and more towards things that are less and less tactile. And so a guy responded to it, and he said something like, well, you must be an ISFJ if that's what you're doing. And I'm actually an ENTP. And Myers-Briggs, if you're not into that. And that's the thing that frustrates me, is that it's like this idea of like, no, I'm doing this because I'm Mike, not because I'm a type. Or the Enneagram is real popular right now. And I think the Enneagram can be like really helpful, actually, and it's helped me in a lot of ways. But because it's like the thing right now, and it won't be the thing as much in 5 years, but it's the thing right now, I think, because of that, people, like, I'll respond to something, people are like, oh, you're really responding like a 7 right now. I'm like, I'm responding like Mike. I'm not responding like a 7, and I'm a 3, wing 4 anyways, but I'm responding like Mike, because that's who I am. And so I get really frustrated, because what happens is people who sometimes use these things will use it to see you as a type and not for who you are. And what can easily happen is we can do the same things. We could start to see ourselves as a type, start to see other people as a type rather than who we are. Now, these things are helpful. They are breadcrumbs. They give us language. They point us in a direction. They can help us like unmask things that are there that we haven't been willing to be honest about that are there. But there's a difference between knowing your type and knowing yourself. And so knowing your type helps you to discover yourself, but it is not who you are. So they're breadcrumbs. They lead you in a direction. That's my experience at least. Second thing is this, that I've learned to try and pay attention to my energy levels. I think paying attention to my energy levels has been a really helpful thing in understanding who I am, how I respond, how I work effectively, how I lead effectively. I often bought into people telling me, if you're in a church of this size, of X size, as a leader, if you have this many staff, whatever, you should be spending your time doing these things and not these things. And so I did that for a while, that I spent my time doing those things that you're supposed to do if you lead a church of X size. And I hated it. And I would go home at the end of the day just drained. And it was just, I was like, gosh, this is the most miserable thing ever. What I had to learn was like, that's actually energizing to some of these guys. Gene Apple is coming in later today, and I love Gene. And the things that energize Gene are like the exact opposite of what energizes me. And so I learned like, I need to learn from Gene a lot, but if I try and organize myself and my leadership style like Gene, like I am going to kill myself, because I am not him, I'm different. So I've had to start paying attention to what energizes me. Here's how I learned to do this, was to take a week and to make a journal where I'm recording throughout the week, like every interaction, every experience, everything that I do, and just putting a plus or a minus next to it without any kind of like making observation points about it or anything, just plus and minus next to it. Like that gave me energy or that drained me. I was in this meeting and it drained me. I was in this other meeting and it energized me. Well, then when I go back through that, then I start asking what was different about that meeting and that meeting. Why did this one energize me? Why did that one drain me? Why did this encounter, I was one-on-one with somebody, and this one-on-one was incredibly draining, and this one-on-one was incredibly energizing? What was the difference of what was going on there? And it began to tell me things about myself. I began to think about and realize the way that I work and the way that I naturally would lead. I'm in this meeting and I'm leading this one and it's energizing. I'm leading this one and it's not energizing. And I began to realize like there are some meetings that I actually need to lead because I'm the right person to lead it and it brings me energy and what I bring into that room. And then there are other meetings that I need to be in and I need to not lead that meeting. And I need to understand the difference between those. And so I started paying attention to what energizes me. Next was this. I had to start listening to others. And I really like listening to other people tell me what I'm good at. And I can appreciate that. What I learned was I had to listen to what people were complaining about. And that was actually much more truthful and honest. So I had to pay attention to, and they weren't always saying it to me. Sometimes they were, but they're saying it to other people. And so I had to get it second and third hand. I had to hear what are those complaints that would help me to understand myself. So one of our elders one time, I was out at dinner with him, and he just said to me one time, he said, Mike, you know what, you are out ahead of everyone else, and you don't give them time to catch up to you before you move on to the next thing. And so that is me living out of futuristic Strength Finder, right? Like I'm always wanting to, like, what's next? What else is out there? I get bored really, really quickly. And he's like, but we're all trying to, like, we haven't even gotten to where you are by the time that you have, like, gone through it and you're done with it and you've moved on to something else. And so like now you're not one step ahead, you're like 12 steps ahead of everyone. And like that gave me so much insight into myself. There was a couple of people on our staff who were saying for a little while, Mike doesn't want other people's opinions. He only wants you to say those things and he's going to do whatever he wants to do anyways. So what that told me was like people are feeling steamrolled by me. And so I had to start trying to figure out why are they feeling steamrolled by me? Because it actually wasn't true. Like I actually wanted people's opinions and I wanted like really strong arguments and I wanted people to fight with me on things. But one of the things that I began to learn was that if I didn't have people in the room who also exerted strong self-confidence, well, then they were feeling berated by me and they were feeling steamrolled by me and they were feeling like I showed up with a preset agenda. So that began to help me understand like my style and even like, okay, what does it mean to lead well out of this and not just to be like, well, that's just who I am. So take it, suckers. Like, in fact, one of the things actually that somebody said to me one time, I am a big fan of like trying to process the part that you're going through. It just like instead of just sitting in your own head all the time, I think that there's certainly a place for that. And I think that there's a part of this is silence and solitude, discovering who you are, but like people that you process this with. And sometimes it's people who have no idea, they don't know you well, and they don't know your situation well, and they give you great insight. So I was with this guy one time at breakfast, and we just knew each other a little bit, but I really respected his leadership. And so I was describing to him some problems that I was having on our team, and I was telling him about these problems, and he said, here's the thing, Mike, and he drew me this picture. He pulled out a napkin, he drew me this picture, and he drew it like this, and I thought he was going to ask me to come to Christ. He said, you're over here. You're over here, and the place where you want to get is over here. And he said there are two ways that people tend to think strategically. He said for some people, they're over here and they sit and they ponder and they take in all these ideas and they read stuff, whatever, and they figure out the 14 steps that it takes. And they're going to wait to take the step until they've got that all figured out. So some people are strategic like that. He said, but what you are is you jump over there and you get over here and you're like, I have no idea how I got here, but I'm here now. And he said, now what you have to do is you have to learn to look backwards and say, how did we get here? And then you build the steps backwards. So some people are strategic beforehand. Some people jump into it and do it and they're able to be strategic backwards. He said, the problem is you're trying to be this first one and people are expecting you to be the first one when you're actually the second one and you haven't figured out how to own that and you haven't figured out how to invite others to be a part of that with you. That was a game changer for me. That was so significant. This is the only time, maybe not the only time, I probably had lunch or breakfast with this guy 2 or 3 times at most, but that was a significant thing for me to understand. So try to listen to others, both in what they're saying about like me negatively, but then also in listening to others as like I describe, here's this tension point I'm going through, and they help me unpack it. Next, I have learned to pay professionals and not shy about that or afraid of that, and I think that they are worth their money. So I have 3 professionals that have been helpful for me in different ways. I have a counselor that I go to, and my counselor really helped me be comfortable tapping into like my emotions and dealing with them. That on my strength finders, where like for my boss, his self-assurance was like 34, empathy was 34 for me. And I would sit in these like strength finder coachings and they would tell me like, hey, you really should work on your empathy. And I'd be like, that's really funny. And they're like, no, you really should work on your empathy. And I remember actually one of our staff, I was in a meeting with her and she began to share something really vulnerable and she starts crying and she's behind her desk and I'm just sitting there just staring at her. She's crying. And then she looks at me and she goes, you should hug me now. And I was like, oh, okay. Like, and so like I needed to deal with that. And that's helped me to own who I am. I see a spiritual director or seeing a spiritual director. My spiritual director, she helped me to learn how to hear and encounter God in fresh ways. She also helped me to learn not to let intellect be a substitute for encounters. that what I will do is I will intellectualize things in order to keep them at a distance. That if I can describe it, if I can theorize about it, if I can read books about it, it doesn't have to affect me because I can talk about it and I look like I know what's going on, but I don't actually own what's going on. And then I went through a life plan process with a friend of mine, and I always made fun of people who call themselves life coaches. And I was like, it's a certificate that you get on the internet for $1.59. But I'll just tell you that my friend was incredibly gifted at it. And what he did was he helped me put language to who I am. And it was so helpful. I spent 2 days with him doing this, and it was so helpful. All that stuff cost a lot of money, and all of it was incredibly worth it. So paid professionals. Next is growing an awareness of the dark side of my strengths. Growing an awareness of the dark side of my strengths. When I was going through Strength Finders, what the theory was, and I don't know if the theory's changed at all, was you focus on strengths. And it was like an exclusive focus on strengths, like focus on all that stuff and disregard everything else. And with that, what I realized I was often missing is I was like, here's how rad I am. And I'm missing, like, here's how that plays itself out in some really damaging and dangerous way. And so one of the things that I've learned, and actually the Enneagram is very helpful at this, as one of those breadcrumbs that's helpful at me at uncovering this. So being somebody who's more naturally self-assured and who's more naturally competitive, one of my most natural dark sides is that I want to make things appear like they're successful. And so I will do whatever it takes to make things look like they're successful. I won't necessarily lie, but I will find ways to like tell things or only tell part of the story or not tell that story in order that things have an appearance of success. And so I have to pay attention to that when I'm making decisions. I have to pay attention to that when I'm describing something. I have to pay attention to that when I'm in a meeting. And so that for me has become a significant part of understanding my leadership style is where is the dark side going to come up and where is it going to like start hurting what's happening in this space. And I have to be so acutely aware of that. My strengths will naturally come out. My dark side has to be dealt with. And then next is this, it's regular self-evaluation. So I have learned to lean strongly into the prayer of examine. That's been incredibly helpful for me. Prayer of examine is essentially going through your day, and the way that I do it, people do it slightly differently. The way that I do it is just simply walking through my day with the Lord, inviting the Spirit into that, walking through my day and saying like, God, where were you present in this? Where was I missing? Where was I aware of your presence and leaning into it? Where was I missing? And so what happens is like the Spirit will often lead me into spaces where I am like, wow, I responded really weird in that encounter. And I just begin processing with the Spirit, like, why did I respond weird in that encounter? You pay attention to things that don't feel right, they don't feel good, they kind of give you a hiccup when you start thinking about it. And so in order to do that, like you have to have some times of solitude. And sometimes that's just an hour during the day, sometimes that's half a day, an intentional getaway, sometimes it's longer. I just, a year and a half ago, finished a sabbatical. And the first 23 days of the sabbatical, I went on a road trip by myself. And I'm not an introvert. I don't naturally know. There were bets going around on how long I would last because I had often done like, I'm going to do this 4-day personal retreat by myself. And 18 hours later, I would be home and I'd have some like reason why I was home. But it was really like I just couldn't be in solitude. And what happened during those 23 days, like when you are by yourself, you get to these points where like you can't keep pretending to yourself any longer and you have to push past it and you have to go deeper than that, and so I couldn't help but to do that. And so I've just learned like I am not naturally going to find solitude. I have to have it, and it's become like a vital part of my health and understanding who I am. And then a part of how I discovered who I am and how I lead is by defining what I'm not. So sometimes it's a lot easier to say, I'm not like this. Like I said, I'm not like Gene. I'm not smart. I'm not good looking. I'm not athletic. Not nearly as good as Gene. And when you can define what you're not, I think you can understand a better idea of like, this is who I actually am. It's not bad to say that. It's not bad to say like, this frustrates me. And then you start to define what you need to thrive. I need to start to define what I need to thrive. And this is unique to you, but over time you just start collecting things and you start realizing it. And so this is a part of my ongoing list of the things that I've discovered. Like, I will lead well when I'm doing these things that are both things that like I need, that are part of my strengths, and are also things that I need to be aware of, like the dark side. So it's I need to figure things out along the way, and then pay attention to how I got there. I need seasonal commitments and objectives. I don't do well with long-term commitments and long-term objectives, and so I work better in seasons. I need variety. I need to be driven by values and not big goals. If somebody comes to me and says, here's the big goal we're all going after, like, that's just not inspiring to me. But if somebody comes to me and says, here's who we're going to be, and like that gets me motivated. I get motivated by intellectual stimulation. I love to help resource others. I need to feel like I'm rebelling against the status quo. And so even if we're doing the most normal thing ever, if somebody can help me frame it in a way that feels like, oh, we're doing this thing that's everyone thinks about it like this, but we do it this way, like that gets me energized. And so I've learned, like, I need those kinds of things, and I need to be aware of my capacity to make things appear differently or to make things appear better. So out of all that, just really quick, let me go through these. This is what I'm learning about in leading with this kind of recognition. So I'm learning, because here's the thing, like, as we understand ourselves, like, it can become incredibly narcissistic, right? It can be all about, like, I'm going to lead the way that I want. And if everyone in our church or organization is leading the way that they want, like, it's just chaos, right? Or it becomes navel-gazing. It's like, look at how great I am, and I like to talk about me all the time. In order to move it into servant leadership, it has to move beyond that. So, like, how does this make the organization better? How does this make the people around me better? So here's what I'm learning with that. One is that I want to make the person more important than the profile. I want to make the person more important than the profile. Here's what that means. If we have expectations of a certain role or job, whatever that sort of thing is, that if the right person is doing it, then I might have to change what that role is some, because I want the right person to do it more than I want to say, well, this is what it needs to look like on paper. So I want to discover, how are they wired? How do they lead? What is their uniqueness? And as we discover that, we adjust what their role looks like in order to help it fit within both what the organization needs, but also within who they are. And we don't hold so doggedly to the profile that we end up killing a person who could actually, like, benefit us in all of these ways, if we would let them run a little bit with who they are. The next thing I'm learning is to not confuse what I need with what the organization needs. There are two different things. And I think for a long time, I thought because I'm the lead pastor, like, the church needs what I need. Like, I need to lead out of these. So I need challenge. Challenge is one of the things that I need, and I need variety. But one of the things that I've learned is a church needs stability. And so when somebody is leading who wants challenge and variety, you want to change things all the time, and you want to blow things up, and there are things that people hold dear, and you want to blow it up because you're like, there's a better idea that we haven't thought of yet, and the fact that you guys are doing this thing is keeping us from thinking of that better idea, and so let's get rid of it so that there's space for that new idea. And I do think sometimes it needs to happen. I think it needs to happen less than I would like for it to happen. And so what I learned is, like, the church, the organization that I lead, needs different things than I do. I can't expect the organization to meet all of my needs. And so I have to find other places to meet those needs. It doesn't take away that that's who I am, but I have to be able to, like, stand back enough to say, okay, these are things the organization needs. This is who I am. And there's crossover on that. And there's also things that I have to separate. I have to let those things run parallel paths at times. Next, I have been learning to value others by knowing what they need and what they value, by trying to pay attention to that. So in the same way that we create a typology of, like, these are the different leaders and I want to try and be like them, and we impose that on ourselves, we do the same thing to other people. We're like, oh, all youth pastors are like this. And so then we impose that typology on them, and we think, here's what they need for affirmation, or here's what they need for motivation, or we think everyone thinks like we do, or they respond like we do. And so if we're somebody who, like me, responds to values, is driven by values more than big goals, and somebody is trying to move me forward by like, here's the hill that we're going to take, like that's not going to necessarily get me motivated. And so what I'm learning is I have to, with my staff, with my team, with our volunteers, and with our church, learn to see like, okay, what is it that they need? What is it that they value? And it's kind of like, any of you ever do like love languages? The idea with your spouse that like you receive love in different ways and your spouse receives love in different ways. And what you're prone to do is to want to give your spouse love in the way that you want to receive it, but they receive it in a different way. And so what you have to learn to do is to give them love and affection in the way that they want to receive it and need to receive it. Same sort of thing with people that we work with our volunteer teams. That's what I've been discovering, is that I have to learn like their motivation language. I have to learn their affirmation language, and I have to speak to that. And when I can identify my style, like who I am, and I can say, okay, well, this is me, and where am I imposing who I am onto this situation, as opposed to like understanding them. Next is understanding my leadership style doesn't necessarily change what my job is, but it does change how I do it. So when I understand who I am, how I'm wired, the way that I lead, that might not necessarily for me change my role, but it can change the way that I engage in my role. And so I can start to figure out, well, then what does it mean if I'm the kind of person who doesn't think strategically on the front end, but thinks strategically on the back end? Well, that doesn't mean that I have to stop thinking strategically as a part of my job, but it means that I have to do it differently. So I've been learning that. And then last is this, is that the thing that, this is probably what I've been learning most recently, is people need to know what to expect. So if people don't know what to expect from me as a leader, they impose their own expectations on me. And sometimes those expectations are a typology of a leader that they have. It's a leader that they used to be. It's a leader that they used to serve under. It's a leader that they've read about or seen on TV, whatever it is, and they impose those on you. And so there are all these frustrations and unmet expectations because we haven't figured out, we haven't like actually clarified, well, like, here's who I am and here's who you are, and let's figure out like what that means and what that looks like. And so I have at times hurt our staff and hurt our volunteers because I haven't helped them to know who I am and what to expect from me, and opened up the conversation where it's reciprocal, and that we figure out like, how do we work well together in this, and how do I give you what you need without you having expectations on me that I'm going to be a different kind of leader than who I am. Does that make sense? All right, so I think that's my time, and I think that's it. So thanks, appreciate it.